Welcome to Raw Politique. Today we have Dr. Lara Sheehi, who is a research fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute for Social and Health Sciences. She's also a clinical psychologist and the host of the Psychic Militancy podcast. Her latest book, From the Clinic to the Streets, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures, will be released in May, and I can't wait to read it. Dr. Lara, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Mary.
We are so excited to speak with you today. I want to start with a hard topic, which is Lebanon. We were both born in Beirut during the Civil War, and we left because of it. And this week, more than 1 million Lebanese have been displaced again. Beirut is being brutally bombed again. And you have written about how colonialism relies on forced forgetting, right? On making every crisis seem like it's new, it's an isolated event with no history. But for the Lebanese people, I mean, that psychic wound seems to be the opposite. You can't forget, yet the world is telling you, act like it's the first time. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on Lebanon generally, but also what is being done to the Lebanese psyche right now.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And I feel like I was in a conversation yesterday with somebody who had said, it feels like nobody's talking about Lebanon, which I think we do have that feeling. Like on the one hand, Lebanon is overrepresented sometimes, but this is the piece for us to think about is what are the representations of Lebanon and what are not the representations of Lebanon? What make it sort of into public conversation and what doesn't? And I think this tells the story of Lebanon as well, right? So the situation, as you said, is dire, and it's also one that has a long history. This is not new. So this is a continuation, just like we saw in Gaza. If you think about the genocide in Gaza as a natural extension of Zionist settler colonialism, we can see what's happening right now as probably the only possible outcome with fierce resistance against a long project of the same type of settler colonialism and the same type of imperialism that is coming together. And I think that's actually really important because I love what you said that, like, on the one hand, you know, settler colonialism and imperialism insists that we forget and dislodge us from history. On the other hand, in the Lebanese psyche, you and I both know that there's a constant return back to the Civil War, back to moments before the blast, 2006, all these sorts of things. But I think this is the piece to pay attention to, is that the forced forgetting is also a redirection or reorientation of our thinking and our psyche away from certain things and an overfocus on other things. So over and over and over again, we see a turning away from the source, or an attempt to turn people away, because I also want to be very respectful to the majority of people on the ground in Lebanon that understand where the source of their suffering on a structural level comes from. I think by and large, people do understand that there's a settler colony that happens to be set up as their neighbor over top of Palestine. And they understand that American interventionism gets them nowhere. They also understand that there's an ongoing project of French colonialism and French meddling in the context of Lebanon. They also understand that there's a class of billionaires that doesn't care about their well-being and that will do everything, including activate confessionalism and sectarianism, so that they sort of end up being the ones who suffer. So this is what I mean about, like, the forced amnesia is an amnesia about how we have always been connected with a struggle, a revolutionary struggle for the liberation of our region. That struggle runs through Al-Quds, but has always included Lebanon. In fact, Lebanese and Palestinians have always fought side by side without a separation in terms of, like, what we understand as, like, national politics, and in defiance of Sykes-Picot. It goes back that long. The forced amnesia is one that would make people feel isolated in that struggle. The things that they are then instead asked to focus on is their suffering, the fact that somehow the resistance is to blame, for their suffering, that somehow if Hezbollah didn't exist, that their suffering would magically disappear. Now we're hearing more and more emboldened conversation about normalization talks. Like somehow if you were to just make peace with the settler colony, then your situation would exponentially get better. We hear also conversations about the ways that French colonialism was actually good for Lebanon. These are the sorts of things that people end up, quote unquote, having to remember as a way to perform good Lebaneseness, as a way to uphold the hierarchy of Arabness and the special character of Lebanon. These are all examples of colonial psychological warfare that people then end up internalizing, because the more pressure you have to uphold these things at the expense of other types of memories and histories and realities, which happen to be realities of a warrior people that have always had their eyes on who the source of suffering is coming from and a commitment to fight alongside their Palestinian siblings.
Lara, I love that. And I actually wanted to bring up the topic of people blaming the resistance. I wasn't sure if I was going to do that, but you've done it. So I just want to go a bit deeper there. You do hear this. I have friends from all different Lebanese backgrounds, and you often hear that blame to the resistance. This is all because of the resistance. But that's real for people. They really believe this. So what would you say to them? One, and what would, that psychic militancy that you speak about, how would it manifest for them?
Yes. Yeah. What I would say to them is that it's not about arguing with people about what they feel. I think affect states are real and they are mobilized in particular ways. But that's the invitation I would have to people, is to say that, in the course of the study that I have done, I've come to realize, and I think all revolutionary fighters over history have realized this, and political prisoners realize this, that the psyche and the affect, so our emotions, our interior world, are mobilized by political projects towards particular ends. They're not innocent feelings we feel, right? So why would this be any different? What we know for a fact is there has been a long-term project, particularly in Lebanon, and specifically against Hezbollah, especially after 2006, when they did have a massive defeat they defeated the settler colonial state, and they had a rise actually in public opinion towards Hezbollah. All of a sudden, we start to see the consolidation of a massive propaganda and psychological warfare campaign that came from Arab states, let's say, and the United States, right? And when I say Arab states, I mean Gulf states primarily, in tandem with the United States, who realized, oh, wait, this is actually the worst thing that could happen to us, is that this specter of quote unquote terrorism that had preceded also 2006, by the way, right? Building up Hezbollah as the terrorist, as the one thing that stood in the way of Lebanon being a Western country, is if you could just get rid of this one thing, you all could be as progressive, as free, as open as any other country in the global North. Now, that's laughable if you look at, the so-called freedoms in the global North. But this is what I mean about affect being real. These identifications with white supremacy have a very long history and have been worked on for a long time. They're not born just yesterday, right? So Lebanon as the Paris of the Middle East, all these sorts of things that you're reared on, come to live somewhere. Now, what happens when then you have a counterforce that you are told, look there, that's the counterforce to you realizing all of these wonderful realities of your world. Now, of course, this comes after a long history of the PLO, the PFLP, then leads up to Hezbollah. So you can see that's what I mean by long-term project. But we do know that after 2006, there was actually a propaganda campaign that was brought together between Lebanon and Saudi, between the United States and Saudi specifically, with specific target against Hezbollah, and more so, this is the part that's really, really, really horrible, a specific anti-Shia propaganda campaign. And this has been fed across an entire new generation now, right? So when people feel this, all I ask of them is to consider who benefits from this feeling? What system might it shore up? Because if we can understand the psyche as contested space, if we can understand emotions as being central to identifications with power, then we have to also understand that anything we're feeling to that degree might be doing something outside in the real world. It's not just inside of us. When we blame the resistance, right? Let's say, I'll give it to you. You think that that's the resistance that's sitting in you. Even though I want to make it clear, I don't believe that.
Sure.
What is it that's being taken out of focus? What is it that we end up forgetting as an originary source of the actual suffering? They are larger structures. It's poverty. It's a necropolitical class of warlords who hoard money in Lebanon and, like I said, activate sectarian wounds to make sure that they remain in power. And most especially, it is the most vicious settler colonial regime that is supported by the biggest and cruelest empire in the world. That is what is the source of your suffering. When you blame only the resistance, you're inverting. There's a psychic inversion that's happening. Like, what came first? It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I love those questions that you're inviting people to consider. I want to expand the conversation a little bit into where I'm based, Jordan, where you don't see exactly that phenomenon, but you see this internalized lack of agency, this internalized hopelessness, which I personally don't feel because I wasn't raised here. And I just have this, I don't know where it came from, but the sense of agency that we can do things and we can make choices and all this kind of stuff. But I do live in a place where, of course, we have a lot of people doing good work, but you have this general sense of apathy. We can't do anything. Sort of depoliticization of the people, desensitization. Where is that coming from? And you've mentioned reskilling.
Yes.
What does that look like here? Yeah.
Yes. Big, such small questions we have today, right? I love this, Mary. I really appreciate it. This Jordan is a wonderful example of what I mean by a long-term project, right? That we can think about the long-term project of conscripting what we might call native bourgeoisie or Arab that are from a particular class, a construction of that into this coordination with larger regimes of power, always under the promise of you will do better, right? We see a similar version of this with the GCC states, with the promise of bases will keep you safe. And what we have seen in the recent war is that not only was that a lie, but it also completely takes the veil off of the actual racism at the heart of it that says that you actually are here for us to use as in any way we want. And the real goal is the stabilization and longevity of empire and its, settler colonial state, now known as Israel. That has become very clear. Urdun in many ways was the first stop of that tour, right? Now I think part of the thing about folks there is that there is a version of reality testing, and then there's also a version of reality bending, and I'll explain what that means. When people feel like they have a lack of agency, what I mean about reality testing is that on some level, they are accurately perceiving the structures that have been constructed over a long-term project to keep them in their place. This is what Frantz Fanon would say, is that you have one space and that's there. You are not allowed to come out of this. And that includes risk that's involved with that. That includes certain danger. There's a surveillance machinery that comes with that. So I never want to come off as flippant, as like prescribing things to people, as though I don't know the concerns or the realities of what might be at play, right? On the flip side, I think you can see, just like you said, that somehow you feel like there's something inside of you, but these like sparks of creativity and defiance despite. We saw when Gaza, and this is what I want to refocus on, just to show people like the reality bending, because the long-term project is also consistently telling the story over and over again. You have no agency, stay in your place. There's nothing you can do. This is a foreclosed loop. What are you going to do? Khalas, it's a monarchy and this is what you do. And if you come up against it, you're going to end up in prison. That might be one version of the story. And also, despite that, when the genocide in Gaza started, we saw so many people in the streets in Urdun. We saw people coming up against their government. We saw people say, not in our name. We saw people try to show, even within the confines of these restrictions that we feel, that there's still a sort of sense of responsibility and wajib to something else being possible. For me, that's part of the reskilling. It's a repetition that happens. Now, what ends up happening, because these power structures are so strong and so ferocious, if one time you go out in the street and something doesn't change, what the structure ends up telling you is, see, what's the point? Khalas. Just stay at home. Ahsan. You know, nothing can change. But the repetition of violent systems to tell us over and over and over again that you are small, because if that were true in its essence, it wouldn't need to be repeated every single day in every single way. You wouldn't have to have billions of dollars of surveillance machines and coordination with other monstrous states to make sure that that happens, right? So I think in reskilling, it's a reminder to us about how much we will have to repeat. And if we look into history, we see the years and how many times people repeated over and over and over again their will to live and to liberate themselves, for something to shift and change. I will offer one last concrete example of this. Gaza, the most locked down place on earth that we were told, talk about zero agency. We were told there's nothing these people can do. There's a fence, there's surveillance, there's a state that has everything under control. There's nothing they can do. And on October 7, 2023, we saw that fence come down. We saw that fence come down. Mm-hmm. Now, people can go and say, oh, what happened and all these sorts of things. And I'm not trying to take away from the magnitude of suffering, but nothing can erase that moment in which people who were told you have nowhere else to go transformed a bulldozer into a mechanism of liberation and brought the fence down. No one will make that go away. That's reskilling.
I know we've gone on for a while, but it would be remiss of us not to talk about Cuba. Yes. I know we've spoken about the region a lot, but these are all linked struggles. So I'm sure viewers know that Cuba's grid collapsed 2 days ago. 10 million people woke up in the dark with no food, no water, no internet. And Trump is openly saying he wants to take Cuba. And we know that Cuba has been a model for resistance and sumud for decades. And we know that's why it's a target.
Yes.
I'd love you to speak about Cuba the way you would like, but I'm also curious to hear about your thoughts on what the US is actually trying to do to the Cuban psyche.
That's a great question. I have a dear comrade, Alex Avignon, who talks about revengist politics and how this is a project of people in the United States like Marco Rubio and others who could not get over a leftist win in all across Latin America, right? And I think that's what I would say to what you're trying to do to the psyche is number one, collectively punishing them for not submitting to the boot of empire. You are also telling them that the quote unquote side you chose is the wrong one, which again, let's see the resonance in our region. We're back to this idea, like if you choose the resistance, this is the losing battle. What they're trying to do is win the project that no other presidency has been able to do. You've not been able to break Cuba. Cuba has stayed committed to its radical leftist politics, including sending medical missions across the world. Like its center piece of resistance has maintained itself. And that is what this Eurocentric fascist psyche, on the other hand, cannot handle. It cannot handle people who will not submit, right? And I think that's a lesson for us. It's a lesson, number one, about the ferocity that power will bring down on you when you refuse to submit. But it's also one in a deep, righteous dignity that understands who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed, and a commitment to liberation, irrespective of the price that's being paid, because the price was already being paid. Again, if we go back to the long-term project against Cuba, this has been decades that it's been strangled and strangulated. Now we're seeing the extreme versions of that, right? This is the pace at which it was going, if any of us were paying attention, in terms of the ramping up of violence. And this is where Gaza comes in too, is that when we have a world in which this level of impunity is enacted and taken out on an entire population, it is a direct link to seeing what we are seeing right now in Cuba with also the same type of impunity. The one that will say that, like, we will not let communism win, and we will do everything in our power, including genocide, an entire population. This is what we're seeing.
I'm just curious, Lara, from where you are sitting in the belly of the beast, seeing sort of US imperialism and empire on steroids now. Are you optimistic overall? Because sometimes I feel like I'm a bit off by being optimistic. I just have so much faith that things can change. But I'm wondering, from where you sit with your wealth of knowledge, how do you see things?
I see it the same way, and that's psychic militancy. Psychic militancy is about us being sure. It is about us being sure about the victory of our liberation struggles, not because we're delusional, but because we are tracking, being attuned to, registering all the things we've been talking about, all the signs that tell us things are shifting. For us to look away from that, and I understand the pull because the destruction is so high, the price is so high, and to remember, but to tell folks to remember is that has always been the price. We're just being clued into it now. There have always been parallel worlds that people have lived in that have always paid the price. We're just being clued into it on a global scale. On the other side, what are all the moving pieces we are seeing that tell us that US empire is in rapid decline, that the Zionist entity has lost the narrative entirely? It cannot go back. This is why it's actually more ferocious. The change in the United States is exponential. People get it. By and large, people get it. Even with this war against Iran, people are connecting the dots. People understand. They don't trust their government. They understand that it is an imperial project. If you talk about Jewish youth in the context of the United States, I think there was a poll the other day that was like overwhelmingly between 18 and 32, they disidentify from the state of Israel. Not just say they're committing genocide, they entirely disidentify from the state. Things are coming undone. And I think that's what history also tells us, is that despite the fact that power will use everything in its reach to ensure its longevity, that also structures of power have always come undone. And we're seeing that. And I think it's okay to say, yes, all the fruits of the labor over time. And I think the more people that are involved across the spectrum, the more likely it's going to be, because it's 1,000 cuts. Nothing can sustain 1,000 cuts, no matter the folklore that power tells. It just can't.
I think that's a beautiful way to end the show. And I'm so happy that I'm not delusional. Dr.
No.
It was amazing speaking with you. I cannot wait to read your book, From the Clinic to the Streets. I'm going to be gifting it to everybody. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Mary. I really appreciate it.